In my last video on the marker lore, I spoke on a divide within the story, and whereas many people did agree with my commentary, there were those who did not agree, with an individual who would twist the lore or scenes of this grim reality to make their interpretations of the story make sense, even when there is plenty of evidence to debunk the recombinant lifeform plot, or explanation of the necromorphs being presented with such evidence to provide clarity. Only overly harsh and dismissive comments would be issued back. However, this encounter has given me more ideas for content for the future. I also stated that I did not read the books, but I did do a lot of research into the topic, which perhaps I was wrong to do so. However, I feel the main issue is due to the sources of information that may be incorrect, as I myself have found things within the searches that do not add up with the games or the background information. After reading the books and going through them, looking for anything that shows lore on markers and the connection between them and the necromorphs that add up to the end game of their evolution or story, I thought that perhaps we shouldn't just look into the written works, but go through all of the media, whether that would be the books, the comics, the films, or the games, to see a more consistent story. In this video, we'll be going through the lore surrounding the markers in a retrospective to find out if there is a cohesive story that a few in the majority seem to either see or twist to justify their interpretations. Some parts of the story is up to interpretation, and the reason as to why certain aspects of the markers and necromorphs that do not pop up again in later entries, but we will get into that later on. I will also be going through the lore as it has been released to us chronologically, and only then will I give my conclusion to this topic. So let's move into the retrospective of the markers. Within the comics, the colonists all start to begin coming down with a sudden case of nightmares when people try to sleep, with that developing into insomnia, the stress issue to them due to the lack of sleep, along with the people getting slight headaches that grow stronger as the course of the story unfolds. This leads into people developing depression due to all of the issues piling on top of them, which then leads into extreme paranoia, and then into extreme aggression. People would also see apparitions or ghosts, as some would rationalize them to be, who all came with the same message of not letting the extraction continue as planned, not letting them take it, which plays into what Isaac would also begin to see later on in the era. Dead Space is to be the first in the main game series that depicts the outbreak 7 days after the extraction of the red marker, in which you play as engineer Isaac Clarke, who is in search of his long-lost girlfriend, Nicole, after receiving a questionable video. However, he would soon be introduced to the terror that influenced the creation of that vidlog. Moving through the game's levels or the ship's decks, you would have come across these messages that would be plastered on the walls or on certain objects written in the marker symbols, in which they all translate to: Unity is forever, death is only the beginning. Keep us whole. Do not fear death, for it is the ultimate journey, a necessary step to new life. The unity future of mankind is a place, a physical journey that must be taken, a pilgrimage reserved for only the privileged ones when the time comes. Keep us whole, make us whole, marker, the sacred relic, the message from our creators. Humans will learn that by death of their worldly spirit, they will be reborn in unity as a stronger community, unending. Let us be one. Black marker. The time has finally come. Don't be afraid and rejoin the Holy One Ultiman, our martyr, our pioneer. Ultiman, our martyr. Ultiman, our pioneer. Don't you dare question my faith, believe or die. Ultimate be praised, sacrifice is inevitable, the pilgrimage is at hand, unity is at hand, live for the church, die for the church, give unto the church, and the church will give unto you. The body is holy, and the church is the safekeeper of this holy vessel. The ships are coming for the chosen. Do you believe? Personally, I believe these to be written by unitologists and not being messages that are coming from the marker. These serve to be the Easter eggs for the game, as all of these seem to stem from unitology and their core beliefs within this era of the story. However, there is one that does point out to being the ships are coming for the chosen, which could mean something for Catalyst, but more likely I think it's talking about the red marker being the chosen, but that is up to your own interpretation. In an audio log that is called Colonists' Problems, Dr. Kine is recording himself talking about the problems with the colony, and in his level of expertise, he has no doubt that it must have something to do with the marker. Quote, almost 40% of the colonists are experiencing a form of dementia. The obvious symptoms are acute depression, insomnia, and hallucination. Incidents of violence and even murder also indicate extreme paranoia. In a text log called Interesting Results, it goes into detail concerning a message we are all too familiar with, that being, make us whole. Referring to Harris with a doctor's study on him, Harris claims he threatened the doctor because he had to stop the dreams and the faces, and that he'd kill again to make it whole. What that means I haven't determined yet. A most intriguing case. And in the last mention of the marker in Dead Space, the backstory log, the red marker, goes into a lot of details about the cosmetic side of things and the symbols, what they translate to, along with the activation and recombination. Quote, the reddish hue is said to be cosmetically different, not indicative of a flaw, so that throws out theories about the colors of the markers. It also goes into detail about the sound frequencies and the electromagnetic spectrum to alpha, delta, and theta brainwaves. Isaac would also see hallucinations along with the apparition of Nicole, who tells him that the marker needs to be taken to the colony, back to the pedestal, with such quotes as, replace what had been taken, and make us whole. When the marker becomes whole once more, Nicole then says, thank you, Isaac. We are whole again. We are whole. The apparitions from all of the media surrounding the first game shows a different set of apparitions than the later pieces of media do, showing them to be good rather than evil. In the backstory log, the red marker also speaks on what the necromorphs are, along with how they came to be, but we will move on to that later on. Dead Space Extraction is a prequel first-person arcade shooter that was available on the PlayStation 3 and Wii consoles that depicts the events prior to the colony outbreak and all the way to the opening scene of the first game in the main series, and shows us more of the colony and the planet cracker that runs parallel to the events in the comics and the animated film. There isn't much to go off of in Dead Space Extraction in regards to the marker lore or the apparitions. However, there are plenty of whispers in the game that will tell you that you are going the wrong way, along with other things which does play into Dead Space Martyr. In this game, there are some hallucinations or apparitions that do attempt to bring harm to the characters, as well as others presenting advice, just like what happens if you choose to go the wrong way or an alternative way. Dead Space Downfall is an animated film that depicts the events within the USG Ishimura at the time of the outbreak on Aegis 7. Through the characters inside the ship, we get an insight into how the infestation progressed to the point where most of the personnel had perished. Not a lot of lore is presented about the marker once again. However, a good apparition would visit Alyssa after she blacks out when she discovers the marker was preventing an outbreak due to the dormancy field. The apparition would say to her, "There's one more thing you've got to do. Save the ship." However, one of her team does become deranged after hearing a collection of whispers, along with Ramirez, who tells Alyssa that they have gotten into his head, unaware that the marker was speaking to him through these whispers. Dead Space Martyr is the first book in the series that depicts the events that was referenced in the previous games, film, and comic, where we follow a journey towards the birth of unitology, the discovery of the black marker, the hell that would be unleashed as a result of research, and how Altman became a martyr for unitology. In the events, the marker signal seems to change people that dives down to its presence within the Gulf of Mexico. However, it only affects certain people at this point in time, changing them into more of a feral state by presenting the characters with trauma. However, the book presents the readers with apparitions that tells the characters that they should leave the marker alone. They don't want to know what it does. However, the book does talk about convergence, with some of the apparitions telling the characters to stop what they are doing. They need to stop convergence, so that convergence will not come into play later on. Other apparitions would state that they should have left the marker alone, which seems like a warning, but then some of them influence the affected to kill themselves as well. The marker also seems to produce dreams, nightmares, and visions through its signal to the affected, all pointing to the marker's capabilities and the oncoming outbreak. The Mexican witch had spoken about the visions to be warnings to the inhabitants of Earth and other worlds. The book also brings in things like the Mexican witch being 1,000 years old. However, it sounds more like a rumor rather than actually being factual, like the boogeyman stories that people would tell their children that exaggerates the truth as the woman is talking to a child. The book also talks about convergence not to be what Dead Space 3 brings to the table with this quote, "Convergence is not the only thing that matters. You should leave that thing down there. They want us to become one. We have to be very careful, otherwise it will be the end of us." People begin talking about the tale of the devil within the events, with that being an old folklore. When someone sees the marker, they make the connection of the appearance of the marker to the tale of the devil. The event of Martyr also goes into what effect the marker has on communication equipment, giving them a very statically interference to them, which is consistent to all of the media, which seems that the glitchy and heavily static communications within the games, film, and comics are due to being nearby to a marker. The marker is also consistent with the widespread of paranoia being present within these events for previous media within the world. Another example of an apparition acting for the good of mankind is Ada's mother telling Altman that he needs to help her stop the markers from committing to convergence. The believers would also start to praise the marker, listening to the several whispers echoing outward from it, with this quote, "We must lose ourselves to find ourselves. Convergence is the only salvation, for I hear this in its whispers. Unless you can understand what it means to become one with the marker, you shall not have eternal life." Another quote that is very interesting is, "You shall be made one, and you shall lose yourself." This means that when you are being turned into a necromorph and convergence comes, you shall be made one, and you shall lose yourself, with that being losing your individuality. The pulse of the marker signal had started again once 2 scientists and 2 guards were killed and wheeled off to the morgue, as if sending out a pulse when dead bodies are presented near to it. A guard would also be visited by an apparition of his deceased father, who asks him, "Things are going to change around here, son. Which team will you be on? Will you be on the winning team? Do you have good hustle?" Further adding into there being 2 different forces at work here. 2 different apparitions, with there being some that wish to help the marker and others trying to protect humanity. Another piece to the puzzle would be this quote that alludes to the apparitions not being present due to the work of the marker. He did not bring up the hallucinations. He wanted to avoid the notion that the marker was sentient, and in any case, he wasn't sure that the hallucinations came from the marker. An interesting moment I found while reading through the book was this quote. A radio astronomist named Grote Goof made the next breakthrough, suggesting that the marker's signal could be read as a transmission of a sequence of a genetic code. Showalter's team sequenced the marker itself and came up with a genetic profile that was, so he told Altman, remarkably similar to that of humans, further tugging towards the marker reanimating corpses. Another quote that shows the scientists researching and theorizing about the signal pulses, which reads as follows. Maybe even something exactly like humans. I think that the marker has the DNA code for our ancestors. So it records our genetic code, said Altman. So what? Not just records, said Showalter. We think that the pulse transmits it as well, deliberately changing the genetic structure slightly in existing human organisms. It may, in fact, have been the beginning of human life. Grote, in his research into the recombinant life form gleamed from the symbols on the black marker, gets visited from two different apparitions, who separately say to him, with the first being someone Grote secretly loved, I'm just a progression of your mind. You know that. You told me that yourself. You know that I'm a construct made from your memories. And for his grandmother who visits next, you mustn't, she said, and then she slowly faded and was gone. He sighed. He never got much further with the message the marker sent. Never heard as much of it as his colleagues had. He figured it was because his desire to see the girl was too strong, too intense.
Grote, can't you see? This is what the marker wants. You are not thinking straight. Stop and listen. Surrounding the marker is a dead space that will stop this thing in your arm from regressing.
Altman would further state in the books that the dreams are not warnings but visions deriving from the marker, where Ada would ask him to have a baby with her, that she needs a baby along with it to bring them closer together. Altman thinks that the necromorphs are the marker's offspring. He would also talk about the marker's signal reanimating corpses. Here is the quote. What did she mean by having a baby? Were these creatures the crewmen that had been transformed after death into monsters? The marker's offspring? Well, yes, he supposed so. In a manner of speaking, if he was right in thinking that they'd been created by the marker's transmitted code. But unless he was mistaken, his dream about Ada had not raised the issue with him until after the creatures, whatever they were, had spawned. Indeed, he must have had the dream just after the creatures had appeared, even though Altman hadn't known about them until a few moments later, when the alarm woke him up. Martyr would also bring up another piece to the puzzle that does not get brought up again in the later issues, so if this is to be canon, that is entirely up to the reader's interpretation. He could see the hallucinations that were not a function of the marker, but of something else that stood in opposition to it, of something that was ingrained into his own brain. The hallucinations had been trying to protect them, but they failed. The process had begun. Now all he could do was to try and satisfy the marker enough that the process would stop, but not do enough to lead to full-fledged convergence. The book would also imply that the marker does not bestow marker blueprints or mental blueprints to everyone who comes into contact with them. Dead Space Salvage is a comic that depicts the recovery of the USG Ishimura after the events of the first game, that shows the planet Cracker had survived the initial destruction of the colony. In the comic, space pirates find the ship, and upon entering the ship, The crew find organic sludge all over the decks, with that being the remains of the necromorphs and the corruption that had lost its form once the marker was placed on the pedestal and when the colony was destroyed, in which marker shards was thrown out into the hull of the Ishimura. Apparitions in the comic act as speakers for the marker shards. The liquefied corruption had been cited as the catalyst for the outbreak, with it killing Benedict. The corruption is able to be reformed by the marker shards into new and terrifying concepts of necromorphs, including all the ones present in Dead Space along with the ones in Dead Space 2. In the comic, no mention of a recombinant lifeform is mentioned or hinted at, with the corruption replacing the recombinant lifeform in this story. Dead Space Aftermath is the second animated film set to be 3 weeks after the first game's conclusion, in which the occupants of the O'Bannon would be sent to Aegis 7 to stabilize the planet long enough to find shards of Marker 3A, where all hell breaks loose. The Marker shard holds Aegis 7 together with its gravitational capabilities, keeping the planet from exploding, with the atmosphere staying stable, but with rocks and boulders floating up above in the air and sky. The marker shard, upon coming into close contact with Kutna, would send out a series of micro-pulses, resulting in a threshold of pain being obtained. Along with several whispers, he would say to these, I don't understand. The marker would then weaponize his past trauma to further manipulate him and turn him against his allies. As soon as the marker is stored inside of a protective casing that its signal cannot pierce, the planet starts going nuclear, then shortly explodes. The captain would also be able to hear the shard's array of influence within such things as whispers calling out to him. Stross would tell Cho that the symbols of the marker are almost familiar to him, like a dream he has almost forgotten, which implies something to do with the human race's genetics, along with one of the engineers stating that humans were created by aliens, asking another if he really believes it. This plays into the lines of dialogue within Martyr, suggesting that something had imprinted a genetic mental defense mechanism to resist the marker's influence. Stross here, however, is stating that he almost remembers, which seems to imply that something had genetically imprinted memories into the human race as a warning. However, Stross would be presented with a vision for the code for the recombinant DNA. However, in these events, he decides not to follow through with the creation of a microbial lifeform, whether that being he did not possess the equipment to do so or the resources. However, the shard more than makes up for that, as it reanimates a dead corpse right in front of him that Stross exposes to it. And after another hallucination, Stross would release the necromorph, allowing it to cause unbelievable chaos and anarchy throughout the corridors of the surrounding area. However, he also allowed the marker to spread its signal to the other corpses lying in the morgue. Vivian would also return to Kutna, who actually ends up showing them a safer way to traverse through the ship, bringing them back into the good version of the apparition. However, another version of her would later lead Kutna to his death. In the first scene, however, Stross does imply about convergence, stating that they shall all be made whole. The interrogators allude to a mental blueprint, as they are looking for those who had come into contact with the marker, stating that they will come to great use to them, marking them as key subjects. In the events of Catalyst, two brothers become separated at a young age, with one being fostered by a family who would go on to become successful within the world, along with getting an education. The other would go on to build a life of survival, scavenging to stay alive, having no one by his side other than someone only he can see, being known as the Shadow Man, where he would eventually be captured by sovereign forces and sent to Asperia, a penal colony, where one of the red marker tests would be conducted, being a parallel story to the events in Aegis 7 with the backstory logs. The book does highlight headaches being present for those within the influence of the marker, as if something is trying to poke and prod its way inside their minds. However, while reading, I did not see any indication of a recombination study taking place, with the corruption appearing from nowhere, and does not mention any form of bacteria or microbial life within the book, as if the marker created the corruption out of dead bodies. The book implies that the three markers had been projecting towards Istvan, and when the scientists eventually look into the matter, they find that their combined signals are triangulated to Istvan's prison cell, which is consistent to the hallucinations he had been receiving at that time, along with the mysterious apparition, the Shadow Man. The book also implies that the marker communicates through several whispers. I found it to be most notable in this quote: "Glorious, the next step in evolution, marvelous convergence, the extension of consciousness from bodies to a place both within and between bodies." The mossy tendrils, or corruption as they call it, begins to spread with every pulse wave that comes from the marker. With this, "It's changing," said Bryden. "It's growing stronger. It's becoming more dangerous," said Dr. Dexter. "We need to be careful." She gestured around the little patches of mossy tendrils clinging to the floors and walls. "You see what's happened to the corruption," she said. "There's more of it now. It's spread with the signal." The marker also gives out a whisper in a cryptic manner, telling the two to share it. "See me, understand me, share me." See me would probably refer to seeing the symbols and memorize them. Understand me refers to understanding what the symbols mean, that being the mental blueprint. Share me refers to reproducing the marker based on the symbols that make up the mental blueprint. The marker implies that they must call out louder to summon the Brethren Moons. With this line of dialogue, "We must call out louder and hope for them to hear us and take us into themselves, as you have done, Istvan." This seems to mean that they must grow more powerful to project a stronger signal to reach the master signal to the Brethren Moon. Istvan confirms that the marker steals one's form upon death, as to use as apparitions of their own design. "Who are you?" he asked. "Why do you look different from the other dead?" Jensi paused, confused. "It's me, Istvan," he said. "Jensi?" He watched as something changed in Istvan's eyes. "Jensi!" he responded. "So you are dead now as well? How did you die? Or perhaps this is not a thing that the marker knows how to tell me in stealing your form." It is shown to us here that the marker also manipulates humans with promises of saving them, with lines like this: "We can use the marker for good. We can control it. I know how to talk to it and how to make it listen." Lastly, Istvan further implies that the marker reanimates the corpses into necromorphs. With this piece of dialogue: "I remember her. I liked her. Yes, she could be with us. She'll be a follower. We'll just have to help her along. We'll carry her away from the marker and put her where it can reach her, and then she'll come back to life as one of our servants." The usage of the name servant also falls in line with how the oracles in Dead Space 2 Severed call the necromorphs. Dead Space 2 is the second installment for the Dead Space franchise, following up with Isaac's story continuing 3 years after the first game. Isaac would then reawaken in the Titan Medical Center. From there, he would embark on a deadly journey through the Sprawl to escape the Terror by eliminating the source, that being the Golden Marker. Inside of the Ishimura, one of the workers had fallen down a ramp. However, he described it as being tripped by someone, only to see that no one was there, possibly an apparition of the past, paranoia, or a delusion due to the death of the crew being realized, like visiting a abandoned ship, or an abandoned warehouse, or a theme park that had been abandoned for several years. It is noted that the marker has a dementia signal. However, this is most likely a name used to rationalize the reason the marker signal installs dementia into a test subject. It is, however, detailed in the log same signal that the dementia and blueprints all come from the same signal, but also that smart people will see codes and blueprints, but everyone else that is affected will be drove insane by the information overloading their minds. In another log, Tiny Marker, it is stated that a scientist had blacked out at a party, and that when she awoke, she had created a marker through the use of the crystal printing baths, or in our world, it would be known as a 3D printer. In Dead Space 2, there were several logs that did not make it into the game, for unknown reasons, either removed due to being too conflicting with the story, or to discard certain cryptic messages or pieces of lore that was left up to interpretation, such as the genetic defense mechanism, or they wanted to bring it into a future installment to act as another plot twist for the franchise. One of the logs does talk about the recombinant lifeform being present within the government sector prior to the outbreak, in which the unitologist brings to light a mission to sabotage the systems of the government sector, not to be confused with Vandal's mission. Dr. Foster in a log explains that there is no doubt that Isaac is what he calls a carrier, a name for a person who is infected by the mental blueprint, with Isaac becoming obsessed with his past lover, Nicole. Another log states that the human race are objects of revenge. The echo that they have been hearing isn't an echo, which was most likely a staple word to be later changed by the writers. What she probably means is the whispers or voices present within our minds is a genetic defense mechanism planted by whoever created the human race. The species she refers to was to be fighting a war against the markers that spanned over eons. She also states that the markers are some horrific revenge tool planted like a parasite wall space, like caterpillar larvae, and the humans are the larvae. However, I believe this was removed due to being too conflicting with Halo's story, as you can see quite a bit of a parallel right there. A war that spanned over eons, two races, one being the markers, another being a highly advanced civilization. The humans are pawns of these beings though, that doesn't add up with Halo. But then some horrific revenge tool, which is what the Flood basically turned into, being the revenge tool of the precursors. So you can see quite a bit of a parallel right there. And yes, this is a improvised part of the script, but I just wanted to point out a few things with why this log probably was not implemented into the game, and why the writers changed it, or were constantly changing certain things, or constantly removing certain things from the franchise, because they wanted to steer clear of Halo's sort of storyline, so that there isn't a parallel or anything like that. Dead Space Liberation is another comic that depicts the events of Yuxor when a missile strikes the facility housing the marker, creating an outbreak, forcing Carver to fight his way through the twisted necromorphs. From there, he would join forces with Ellie Langford and Robert Norton, where they would travel to find a way to the source of the marker signal. The marker, upon being released from the research station's shell, would let out a large electromagnetic pulse that shuts down all equipment in the region. Almost immediately, necromorphs begin to sprout out, attacking and killing anyone in sight. with no prior mention of the recombinant lifeform being announced here. The third and last installment of Dead Space in the trilogy depicts a broken Isaac being forced to face the terror. Once again, he finds himself in the thick of it, crash landing on a planet full of the Necromorph Scourge, where he and other characters would descend into this hell to turn off the source to the markers, when he would find a very terrible truth and attempt to save the universe from the Brethren Moons. In a text log called Alien Artifact 02, it goes into detail about the whispers in the wind, which are coming from the markers to turn it off. The men who consumed the flesh of the necromorphs begin to hear the whispers inside their minds, as if having a stronger connection to the markers now, hearing, "Make us whole, make us whole, make us one." In the log, Serrano discusses Facility 1. He talks about how the necromorphs communicated with one another. The species, as he would call them, would utilize a signal of telepathy, which hints towards the moons controlling the necromorphs. In the log, Scaff Artifact 17, it goes into further detail about the markers not transmitting the signal, but rather they broadcast a signal that they receive rather than creating it themselves. In Alien Artifact 03, the log goes into detail about one of the privates falling victim to a fellow soldier who kills him to show the changes to his anatomy to the rest of the men. The log also states the same force that twisted his corpse into a deranged killing machine is intrinsic to this planet's evolution. In Alien Artifact 4, the log goes into detail about what happened when one of the alien corpses was to be released from that icy prison. I'm sure we were all surprised when the alien tissue showed twitches of life once freed from its icy encasement. And no one was more surprised than the poor private when a previously unseen appendage snaked forth from the thawed carcass and into his chest cavity. In an audio log, Turn It Off, from Dr. Serrano, he would state, "The moon is the source of the signal. The madness. Make us whole. Turn it off. These are its cries for help. Its call to action. And we are the fools who listened." In another log, Dr. Serrano states that the marker signal permeates everything and everyone is affected differently. Some are driven to rage, others suffer hallucinations, and still others fall into gibbering dementia. In Alien Artifact 08, Dr. Serrano states that the marker signal doesn't just reanimate the dead, it manipulates us into spreading the markers. And now we too have been unwittingly spreading this galactic virus from planet to planet. The propagation of our species has only served to create a source of food and the means of finding it for these moon-sized entities. So, with all the mentions of the marker through the books, comics, films, and the logs, let's go through my conclusion of these events and how they are connected to each other. Due to the many pieces of information presented over the years that were either ignored, replaced, or retconned over the years by the writers, I have to say that my first thoughts of there being a divide were indeed correct, as the plot of a genetic imprint had not been mentioned after Martyr and is only mentioned as being part of a war that waged eons between two races in a log that was cut from the game Dead Space 2. Reasons for this could be not to make the story overcomplicated or confusing as well, as the apparitions in Martyr being either for good or to assist the markers at times did make me feel overly disorientated from trying to figure out which were which. Concerning the second game, Wright Bagwell would talk on the issues. This is tricky. We spend a lot of time trying to make sure that our story isn't too opaque or confusing, but also trying to let the player know that it's not obvious what the marker does or how it works. We want to keep a little mystery about it, The fact is, the characters in the Dead Space universe don't quite understand how it works, or what is going on, so there should be little mystery about it. But again, we are not trying to make it feel confusing to the players. A description of the marker from the Wayback Machine on the Dead Space 3 website would state, "The Black Marker is an alien artifact found on Earth in 2214. It radiates a signal that, depending on your intelligence, either induces dementia or imprints, blueprints into your brain for reproducing more markers. The signal also creates gruesome, violent, life-after-death reanimations of dead flesh known as necromorphs. The marker's final purpose is revealed in the story of Dead Space 3. The description can be seen to be misleading with the part of dementia or imprints blueprints into your brain, as both of these things have happened to both Isaac and Stross in Dead Space 2. For those of you that would still state that the microbial lifeform is still canon and the necromorphs are created from a recombinant lifeform, here is a developer blog which does have its errors when talking about the variants of the marker being both red and black, I will give you that, when the marker from Dead Space 2 was gold, that shot out red flares when primed for convergence. However, it does talk about the relationship between the markers and the necromorphs, in which it reads, "The original black marker is an alien device of unknown origin, discovered under the old Gulf of Mexico on Earth in 2214. The artifact is possibly hundreds of millions of years old. It rebroadcasts a highly concentrated electromagnetic signal that converts dead tissue into necromorph tissue, eventually leading to necromorphs, which the signal can also animate to life. This signal also affects the minds of intelligent life forms, causing dementia in the vast majority of living things, resulting in homicidal and suicidal actions, laying out a rich field of fodder for the necromorph infection. Finally, the signal will manifest a powerful EMP blast whenever a marker goes through an extreme state change. This may happen when it's initially activated or during convergence, etc. So that confirms that the marker does, in fact, reanimate the corpses into necromorphs. As if you're not going to believe me about that, surely you would believe the people that actually worked on the series as a whole. So that is sufficient evidence to suggest that they did retcon the recombinant lifeform subject from the games, books, films, and comics, with Aftermath not mentioning a recombinant lifeform or a microbial lifeform, and instead talks about the signal reanimating the corpse. The change seems to stem from there, as there is no more talk about the lifeform after this film, other than the cut audio log, which seems to be cut due to not being in line with the new direction for the story issued in by Visceral Games, as to prevent falling in line with Halo's Flood, with the two being similar prior to the change. However, before we end this week's video, let's have a brief rundown of the consistent lore in the canon for the markers. I do want to point out that yes, all of these events prior to the change did still happen, as they are referenced in the games. However, the smaller details will have changed with the soft retcon, as that's what a soft retcon does, changes the smaller details like recombinant lifeforms or the microbial side of things with the marker signal that was explored in the various media over the years. Humans in their earliest period of their history would have evolved from apes due to a change to the environment, as when a change is introduced, the species will evolve to combat the change. This is in relation to the black marker due to its gravitational properties, as forced evolution can mean a lot of things, such as it can mean that the signal itself is responsible for evolving and planting intelligence into the minds of the ever-evolving species, and their society within the regions that reside within the world that they are based in. Personally, I believe that the marker implemented the change to force evolution to take over. The Ice Age could have also have been triggered by the marker using its gravitational properties to pull the Earth further away from the Sun, issuing in harsh weather conditions where none should be present for at least a few more months. When the species becomes the dominant force on the planet and has grown to a certain population count, the marker will come out of its dormant state and start issuing out pulse waves and activate the signal to begin traveling outward towards the stars. As I believe the black marker was attempting to show humanity the master signal that would lead them into the heart of a necromorph outbreak in an attempt to resume convergence on Tal Volantis. The signal will also spread out into the populace, providing them with dreams and visions in a further attempt to manipulate them with its cryptic messages. People would also rationalize these to be nightmares, being visions and warnings. However, it is to further pull them along for the ride, as that is consistent with the rest of the series. Many people would feel headaches becoming stronger over time as the marker signal attempts to enter their minds. With the black marker being an ever-present threat over the generations, a mental defense system would have been developed as part of our evolution, as the marker would have been attempting to contact the Brethren Moon on Tal Volantis until the convergence event had been paused. The mental defense would keep out the marker signal for quite some time, but would also weaken over time due to the fatigue of being exposed for too long to the obelisk. Like if you were to take a plastic ruler and bend it back and forth, small cracks would begin to appear, growing in size, until they connect and the ruler snaps in half. This would be why characters feel a slight headache come into play when coming up to a marker, but then would complain that the headaches have been getting sharper and worse as the individual stories progress. However, over the many generations, the genetic and mental defense system would become diluted, with some people developing a weak mental defense, others having a stronger one, and along with others seeming immune to the marker such as Ellie or Lexine. The conflict in the mind wouldn't just cause headaches, but could also present other symptoms as well as, for example, fatigue, nausea, etc. Upon discovery and recovery, the marker will enter a dormant-like state. However, when dead flesh is introduced into the mix, the marker will become active once again and begin to transform the flesh into a variant of necromorph. Most common in this stage is either the corruption or the infector forms. Some people would ask us why infectors are still present in the games and books, and the most likely answer I can give is that they serve to spread the infection process faster, carrying the bacterial components in the bladder-like organ within itself that will pump into the unfortunate body and transform it into a slasher form, to further create chaos as they serve to be the grunts of the necromorph world. The marker also uses the memories of loved ones or trusted people to the affected to further manipulate them into doing what they want them to do. The marker signal will also grant certain people the ability to build new markers, which in turn actually gives them the ability to destroy them as well. As if you understand how to construct something, you will also understand how to destroy it too, as you may have a clear understanding of its weak points, if they possess such weaknesses. The marker will also attempt anything to spread its array of influence, even by using past traumas, to further push people into a delusional state, allowing the marker to further manipulate them. The marker also uses prophets to influence others, like seen in Dead Space Catalyst, when it manipulates Istvan by making him and others believe that he can control them, when in reality it was really using him. When a certain change is introduced to the marker, it will send out a pulse wave of electromagnetic energy that reanimates the fallen into necromorphs, as well as shuts down the opposing team's technology, which would cripple them to a certain extent. Once the death toll has reached the desired amount, then the marker will commit to the convergence event, which has the marker levitate towards the sky, using its gravitational abilities to reach towards the sky, pulling the necromorphs along to lose themselves to its will, becoming one with the marker, creating the final form, the Brethren Moon. Personally, I don't believe the moons create the markers, however, as they use the humans or other species to make more with their technology. Otherwise, the moons and markers wouldn't do this, and would instead focus on wiping a species out, instead of sparing a few to spread their design, sharing the symbols amongst others. Allowing people to escape a necromorph outbreak would heavily benefit the marker's ultimate plan, or at least affected people. The reason the moons possess the marker's abilities and projects an even more powerful signal, that being the master signal, is because there is a marker at the core of the moon, with it being the brains behind the brawn. Even in Awakened, the voice that you hear doesn't sound like one, but many, all synced together, like the bodies all melded into one entity through unity, in the darkest way. When people state that the markers are an evil presence, I would have to disagree, as the markers are only acting within their nature, what they were built for. They are only fulfilling their purpose, as good and evil is a matter of perspective, and it's a human concept or invention. For example, the markers see us as food, essentially. If animals could speak English, how do you think they would respond if you were to ask them how they felt about the human race, if they were to be evil? As we have successfully assimilated them into our society, like in zoos, water parks, aquariums, with pets that we keep as companions, maintaining animals in farms only for them to be slaughtered later on when they hit a certain age. The same could be said for plants, as we, the human race, assimilate other species, either as pets, food or clothing, or even for sport. Just look at those fox hunts. The fox is being chased and killed for fun, for entertainment. Personally, I'd say the necromorphs are on the high ground, at least they don't discriminate. They use everything in the transformation process. You can also bring up the argument that maybe the events transpire in their entirety, only merely happening in those specific events. But again, this is my interpretation, and from what I've seen from the developers, this is not the case. And I believe everything that I have stated up to this point to be factual things, like 2 different apparitions, recombinant lifeforms, and the dormancy field, are no longer canon anymore. Or at least, they weren't included in later entries. If people wish to insist on the reason that they weren't talked about in the later entries was because, well, there was no need to, then that is a poor excuse to be made, as there is a reason to have characters talk about it, even if we're in Dead Space 6. But some will say that I am wrong because the recombinant lifeform is present in the events of Martyr or in one backstory log, as yes, you are correct, but after Aftermath, could you find any mention of a lifeform in Catalyst, or in the games after the change? As I could not when researching and poring over the books and logs. And if it were involved in the late series, don't you think the developers would mention it being the cause for the necromorph outbreak? That's why every YouTuber, every page of information will tell you that the markers do these things is because it was rewritten to be that way. But if people want to believe what they want to believe, that's up to them. But this constant back and forth with a certain individual in the comments section just drives all the fun out of a debate, because of their overly dismissive and harsh attitude. And all I can say is that I'm done with this topic for now. However, I'm not done with Dead Space, much to the dismay of that individual, and will continue bringing more lore and discussion videos in the future. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then please hit the like button, comment your thoughts below, and have a discussion about the lore, and I look forward to hearing from you. Sign up to join the British Alliance today, and ring in the notification bell, allowing all updates to be notified of future content as it gets released to you. And I will see all of you among the cosmos, and be sure to have a good one.